Well, congratulations for finally finding a PlayStation 5. I assume that's why you're watching this video, or maybe you're anticipating getting a PlayStation 5 in the future, in which case come back to the video and rewatch that opening part so it is more impactful. Anyway, today we're going to be talking about your new PlayStation 5 and some things that you should know about the system. Some of the stuff will be kind of basic. Other parts of it may be a bit more advanced and just some helpful tips to get you set up, and some of my thoughts on the current subscription services that have certainly evolved since the PlayStation 5 came out. So if you find the video helpful at all, make sure you like it down below and subscribe to the channel if you're new. And you know what? We'll start with a tour of the PlayStation 5 console. On the back, we have power, HDMI, network, and 2 USB Type-A ports. I recommend having a network cable connected to the PlayStation 5 with Ethernet running directly to your router or modem, mostly because I've found that transfer speeds are much faster doing that, and a lot of that has to do with the potential for interference in the home when it comes to a Wi-Fi connection. If you have no other option and you have to use Wi-Fi, it'll still work. I understand the convenience factor there, but plugging directly in is preferred all the way around. HDMI, it does come with an HDMI 2.1 cable. Continue to use that, especially when you get a newer TV or if you have a pretty feature-packed TV now, as that will take advantage of all the features that are present on the PS5. At the top, there's a little slot, and that's actually for a Kensington lock. If you need to lock your PS5 down for whatever reason, I know people's situations are different, you can buy one of those on Amazon or eBay, and it kind of acts as a bike lock, where you can have one that is a combination-driven lock or with a key, but essentially you tie it down to your entertainment center or something that is at least grounded to the floor, so you can't necessarily have someone run off with your PS5. The front, we have power and eject buttons. Both are marked there, as well as a USB-C and USB-A port. I would use the USB-A port on the front with a little lightning bolt for charging your controller. It's easily accessible, and the USB-C port with the little SS there would mostly be used for quick swapping or changing out any type of external drive that you have, which we'll talk about here a little later on. Next up, we have the stand, which initially looks pretty complicated, but I promise it's not that bad. And once you have it set up with the PS5 correctly, you don't really need to worry about it ever again. If you look at it from the top, it will rotate. And when you rotate it, it will go from the horizontal to the vertical setup. And you can sort of figure this out by looking at the bottom, as there is a little compartment that will become accessible when rotated to the vertical orientation, and it will be hidden when you have it in the horizontal orientation. When vertical, you can take the screw out. You have the PS5 sort of upside down here, and you have the hooks that go in the back, and then the PS5 will kind of slot in as they have it carved out here. Then the screw will go ahead and turn into the PS5. You can use a flathead, or it's actually a deep enough, large enough groove where you can use a penny or a coin. Once that's screwed in, though, your PS5 will sort of float vertically, and it's pretty much ready to go. It has a nice rubberized grip on the bottom as well, just to hold it in place. If you want your PS5 to be horizontal, which is the method I prefer personally, what you need to do is rotate it so that that compartment is hidden. And on the back of your PS5, you're going to see all of the PlayStation symbols, and that's sort of there to help you line up the stand. You want to line up the hooks with the two squares on either end. And with the form factor of the PS5, it should nicely rest up against it to where you can set the PlayStation down on its side, and it will have this nice floating look, which is pretty cool because you can't necessarily see the stand well from like a 45-degree angle looking at the PS5. You have to really go underneath of it to see that a stand is holding it up, and that's purposeful. Sony wanted to make it look like the PS5 was as futuristic as possible, and part of that is it kind of levitating off of the ground. From now on, I think it goes without saying, you'll be looking to buy the PlayStation 5 version of titles in the future. Your old PS4 games will work on the PlayStation 5, whether it's disc-based or anything you've purchased digitally on your PS4 console. Those games sometimes will actually have better frame rate and resolution, depending on the title, of course, and if there has been maybe a patch that's unlocked the frame rate, the PS5 will be able to maximize that. So it is worth going back and taking a look at some of your older favorite PlayStation 4 games, as they may look and run better than ever here. There is one thing that's continued to trip people up with the PS5, specifically the disc-based model, and that's generally how the disc goes into the system, specifically which side faces up. When it's horizontal, it's pretty easy to tell as the disc cover itself looks up at you, and you can see it when you drop it into the system. That makes sense. But when it's vertical, that's the part that seems to be a problem. And in fact, some believe that their PS5 just doesn't read any games because of this. So looking directly at it, you may be inclined to put it in where the reflective data side is facing the rest of the console, when in fact, it's actually the opposite. So you want to have it that the cover of the disc is facing to the left when you're looking directly at it, and the reflective side is, yes, technically facing away from the main body of the system. This clearly is just a way Sony had to make this happen with the shape of the PlayStation 5, but as you're seeing it now is the direction that it's supposed to go in, and just might take some getting used to. Seriously, let me know down in the comments if this is something that you were a bit confused about when you first got the PS5 out of the box and why it wasn't reading your games. So now that we have a basic idea of the PlayStation 5 console as it is out of the box, let's talk about upgrades like storage. The PlayStation 5 is advertised to have about 825 gigabytes, but it's actually much less than that, generally below 700 gigabytes of usable space. The other storage is saved for system updates and other system resources. You're going to run out of that space pretty quickly as you install larger games, especially on the multiplayer side with something like Call of Duty Warzone or Fortnite or others. So you may want to think about upgrading the storage on the system, and there are several different options. The easiest one is having an external drive that you just plug into a USB port on the system. There are many different drives. You're going to want to at least pick out a standard USB 3.0 drive, although you go up to like 3.1, it's going to be a bit faster, and I generally recommend getting a solid state drive of some kind, whether it's a 2.5-inch solid state that's in an enclosure, or you can even go up to an NVMe drive in an enclosure. This will make things much faster when it comes to transferring games back and forth. Off of the external drive, you can play PlayStation 4 games, and if you're using a solid state, things will load in the game just faster overall, as opposed to the mechanical drive that these games were designed to have in mind on that PlayStation 4 console. PS5 games, unfortunately, are not playable off of that external drive. You'll have to transfer them back and forth, but for many people, that may be faster than downloading from PlayStation servers after you completely delete it off of your system. It's just a bit more convenience there. If you want to be able to upgrade the storage and play games directly off of it with PlayStation 5 titles specifically, you're going to have to upgrade the internal storage and add an NVMe drive. This might seem somewhat daunting at first, but it's actually not too bad. I have an entire video going over how to install this, and I will link a compatible drive that Sony themselves recommends. It's from Western Digital. It's the SN850 with a heatsink, and for the most part, this is something that won't take you more than 10 or 15 minutes to do. It requires removing one side panel for the PlayStation 5 and using a Phillips head screwdriver for a little bit. I generally recommend going the NVMe route. It's a bit more work, but it's something you would do once, and it will immediately add 1 to 2 terabytes of storage that can be used directly with PlayStation 5 titles. Just make sure you pick a quality NVMe drive. The Samsung 980 Pro is pretty good, as well as that SN850. This is not an area you want to cheap out on or even go with a slower drive. Stick within the requirements that Sony has put out there with read-write speeds, and just make sure it's a brand that you at least recognize. Trust me, there are a lot of low quality NVMe drives out there with lower prices, but also questionable quality. Now let's go over something you're going to be using constantly with the PlayStation 5, and that's the DualSense controller. That I think it's a good idea to set this up immediately with some basic parameters. One, there's a microphone that is built into this controller, and it's not necessarily obvious to everyone when they first start using it, but it will become much more apparent, especially when you go online, as the microphone is just on by default. For some reason, this is a weird decision by Sony. I would prefer they just have it off by default and then you have to turn it on. But there's that little plastic button at the bottom of the controller, and when that is lit up like this yellow-orange, that means the microphone is off. When it's not lit up, the microphone's on. I recommend going into the settings and having it be off by default. Trust me, I'm helping everyone out on games like Call of Duty now. It turns out people really like to eat when playing their games. The DualSense controller also doesn't have the greatest battery life, so I think it's a good idea to set it up to get the maximum amount possible. And there are ways you can do this. For example, the idle time to off for the DualSense controller, I think if you have that set to 30 minutes as an example, when you're not using your controller and no inputs or anything is happening, it will turn itself off after the set amount of time. That way your DualSense isn't just on for hours on end, maybe when you're watching a movie or you're checking out Netflix. Also, you have that light bar around the touchpad. You can dim that. So even if you find it to be kind of annoying, maybe it's too bright for the dark room, you can turn it down. But also, that's something else that will just play into maximizing the battery life of the controller. I will admit there is a lot to take in with the PlayStation 5 when it comes to the UI and software, but one thing I think is worth certainly looking into right away would be the game bar. You access that when you hit the PlayStation button on your controller, and from here you have a nice little submenu that will give you quick access to different things, whether it's music, which would be the different applications you have set up with Spotify. You can have your notifications. Switcher, you can jump between different applications, maybe games you've played recently. You can actually change your sound around for all different things you're controlling. You can go right to your DualSense controller settings from here. It's a quick one-stop shop for all the different settings and things you may need to access to jump around the menus. You can also customize by pressing the menu button here, and you can change different things out. You have your hidden controls, which in this instance would be broadcasting. So if you want to move that around, you can. It is fully customizable, and if you feel like you maybe want it back to how it was, you just go to reset to default and it'll kick it back. Now let's talk about something that's very important for your PlayStation 5 in the future, and that's maintenance. As long as you set your PS5 up correctly, you should be okay out of the gate, and this has to do with the spot that you decide to install it. So in your entertainment center, just use common sense. Make sure there's not a blanket over your system. Make sure there isn't anything immediately butting up against the back or the front, as there is a clear path of airflow through the system, that being the back and front where the fan is located at the top. And make sure you are at least going in and clearing out any dust or debris. I would say at least a couple of times a year. If you have pets or you're smoking in your house, I would recommend doing this once a month just to try to stop any kind of buildup for hair. And it is very easy. When you take the side panel off of your PlayStation 5, which I'm showing here, there are a couple of different holes in the plastic. These are actually designed to pull out any kind of debris using a handheld vacuum. And this makes it so that you won't have buildup inside the system that can really make systems struggle when it comes to airflow, as you will over time develop blockages. But just by vacuuming or throwing some compressed air into those different holes and just generally wiping down the system from time to time to alleviate any kind of dust buildup, your PS5 is actually set up pretty well. Sony put this system out there after learning a lot from the PlayStation 4 and the PlayStation 4 Pro development. So as long as you do your part, you shouldn't run into too many issues when it comes to heat or noise. Just keep in mind the system does get warm. That's not a weird thing to touch the side of your PS5 and be like, okay, there's a lot of heat coming out of this thing. It's better for it to be outside the system than inside it, but it will also probably work to heat a small room. So, hey, in some cases for the winter time, it's not a bad thing. There are also a ridiculous amount of accessories to buy now. I'm going to say this immediately. Skip out on anything that sells you a fan with it. If it's a fan that goes on the back of your PlayStation 5, sits underneath it, on top of it for some reason, don't need it. Not at all. The PS5, as I mentioned, the engineering that's gone into it and the maintenance that's available, not at all required. Just skip it. In fact, they may do more harm than good in the long run. The accessory that I've found the most use from is the controller charge stand. It will work with two different DualSense controllers, and I mentioned the battery life issues with the DualSense where it's a bit shorter. If you always are charging your PS5 controller between sessions, there's a good chance You're not necessarily going to run through the entire battery in one sitting, as it will typically last anywhere from 6 to 8 hours. So it's a good spot to set up your controllers that kind of displays them. You don't have to plug them in to charge. You set it on top of it and it will make contact with the little pads at the bottom of the controller. And it's typically not very expensive. It's like $30 or less. Most times it's been on sale for like $23. So I think that's a good pickup to have, just to give your DualSense controllers a place to sit and also charge them basically when you're not using it at all times. You can also customize the look of your PlayStation 5. Sony over time had introduced these different panels. Instead of having those white shell side panels, you can remove them without any issues. They slide off, as we talked about with the maintenance section. And you can drop on different colors. They've had like black, red, there's like blue, and most likely they're going to be releasing more and more of these as they go along. There are third-party ones you can get as well, so it is pretty cool to be able to customize the look as you want without too much issue. But now let's talk about the biggest thing with this system, and that has to do with the subscription services and the games. So right out of the gate, they're going to start asking you about PlayStation Plus, and while they show off 3 tiers, technically, there's 4 tiers. Let me explain what I mean. The basic tier for PlayStation Plus is none at all. You can still play online with certain games without having a paid subscription with PlayStation. Anything that's free to play, like Fortnite or Apex Legends or Call of Duty Warzone, you can just download and play without paying that $60 a year fee. That is specifically for paid premium games. Anything that you've bought that you have to pay for, like a Madden or the Call of Duty multiplayer that's not Warzone or Battlefield, then you would need to pay $60 for Essential. But if it's mostly going to be a Fortnite and Netflix box, technically, you don't have to pay that PlayStation Plus subscription. If you do want to pay $60 and get Essential, you will get games each month to claim. You have to make sure you go in within that allotted time and at least press claim. You don't have to download them. This will add them to your digital library. If you do not claim them in that time, they go away. So that means this won't work retroactively. You won't sign up for PlayStation Essential and then get all the games they've previously offered in different time frames for the last several years. What you will get, though, they have a PlayStation Plus collection for PS5 owners, and there's a pretty good selection in there, a lot of classic PlayStation 4 titles that they brought up to the PS5. It was mostly designed to be like an early adopter thing, but they just kind of kept it for PS5 owners. And I think it's a good way to sort of get your feet wet with some of the games that are offered on the PlayStation 5 and being able to see what updates and upgrades they've made for those PS4 titles. Oh, and Essential is also a way for you to back up your saves through the cloud. Yeah, it's something that they lock behind a subscription, but it is at least some security in knowing that if something happens to your PS5, you won't lose your 100 some odd hours you may have in Skyrim. It's in the cloud. You get another PS5, or if you have an issue with the storage on your system and has to get wiped, you can then pull the saves back from the cloud and continue on. From here, we do go up into tiers that are a little newer and certainly ones that didn't exist when the PlayStation 5 first came out. And that starts with Extra. Extra is a tier that I believe is worth the money that they're asking at $100 a year. The reason I say this is because they have done a really good job supporting and adding games to this. And these are large titles from all different kinds of third parties. Think of Ubisoft as an example. There's a bunch of Assassin's Creed games in there. A lot of titles from Sony's own PlayStation 5 library have found their way into this, and you kind of scroll through it and realize the library is pretty large, and if you are getting a PS5 immediately, this will give you a ton of content to catch up on. However, then we go up to a tier that I don't think is worth getting yet, and that would be the PlayStation Plus Premium. This does add streaming capability, and it's mostly used for PlayStation 3 games, as unfortunately Sony has not been able to do any kind of native emulation for it. This tier has a bunch of legacy systems from Sony, that being PS1, PS2, PSP, and that PS3, and they also have game trials. This allows you to have time trials for games that PlayStation will offer from themselves, and third parties. It's a way for you to basically, yes, trial the game, but also be able to carry your save data over. They may give you an hour or two to try out a new blockbuster title that just released. While that's a nice feature, it's not all of them, and it seems to be kind of cherry-picked right now. It is odd sometimes because you'll see, I don't know, Lego City Undercover show up for game trial for some reason. It's very odd what they're picking right now. And then you look at their legacy titles, it's still not a great library, and at times they just outright forget that it exists, and it's very unfortunate because you think of PS1, PS2, PSP games, and I'm sure many you can start rattling off right now, and we're still kind of sitting here with like the best titles being something like an Ape Escape. Not that there's anything wrong with Ape Escape, just that that's the headlining title for a lot of people when they talk about this service right now. The good news is, if you're, say, subscribed to Essentials or Extras or not at all, you can buy these legacy games and just have them as digital purchases. I think Resident Evil is the only one that you can't do that with, which is kind of strange. Essentially, you don't have to go up and buy this tier to have access to these legacy games. You can buy them a la carte and still subscribe to something like Extra and take advantage of that game library. But my recommendation still stands for this one, especially if you're new or returning to the PlayStation ecosystem after years and years. I think there's a lot of content there that will keep you busy for a while, and they continue to pile up game releases each month. Sometimes they'll just drop 10 games in to the extra tier and just continue to add that value. Anyway, I think I've talked long enough here about your new PlayStation 5 system. I hope you enjoy it. Get out there, play some games, and let me know if this was helpful, or if you're watching this and you still have questions, feel free to leave some comments down below this video, as I know there are many people out there in the community watching the videos here on the channel that would be able to at least throw some suggestions your way, or at least try to give you an answer. Thanks, guys, for watching, and I'll see you next time.